Hey, what's going on, guys? My name is Logan with West Desert Shooter, and in today's video I want to give you a full rundown on how I do brass prep on military bulk brass. So this stuff's going to have a primer crimp on it. This is 556 brass from some fired stuff that I was able to pick up, and it's good brass. You just need to get it prepped. It takes a few little extra steps here and there, but overall this also applies to any bulk 223 brass you may have picked up. This is a great process to use for any 223 or 556 brass, or even 762 by 51 if that's what you're using, but all the same steps will apply here. I just want to run you guys through this because I figure a lot of people are probably trying to stash away some 556 and 223 in bulk amounts and need to do a lot of brass prep, so I'm just going to share my process with you guys. So before we actually get to the brass prep, let me run you through all the different tools I've got sitting right here, and then we're going to explain why we have all of them and what each one will be for. Alright, so I'd like to quickly cover which tools that we are absolutely necessary and which tools are optional when you're doing brass prep on military 556 and 223 brass. So this applies to the 308 stuff as well if you're shooting 762 by 51. So anything, all these tools should apply. You'll just have to get the specific 762 by 51 stuff. Alright, number one, you're definitely going to need a pair of calipers, and on here it's semi-optional, but it definitely helps when setting up your resizing die. You will absolutely want a comparator die, and that thing's going to go down to the shoulder on the brass, not necessarily the bullet. The bullet is nice to have when we get to reloading, but for brass prep we want to be able to take a measurement right off the shoulder on the brass there. This little guy is super simple. After you get the primer out of the brass, military stuff, they take a tool and then they smash the brass to hold the primer in place, and that is a military crimp. And this guy just removes that excess brass so that the new primer can easily slip down into there. That is your military crimp remover. Now there are small and large between 223 and 308, which typically has large primers. So be on the lookout for that if you're shooting that. Next up is just a chamfer Deburr tool. This is a little RCBS. This thing's super sharp. It's lasted me for years and it still cuts really well. Definitely a necessary item. That's just going to clean up the necks and make it a little bit easier to seat your bullets and cleans up the brass overall. All right, right here we have our little, this is a Lee cutter and lock stud. Basically you chuck this guy up in your drill and you can rotate your brass around. You hold this with your hand and it'll cut down. This little peg goes through the primer hole, comes in contact with the steel in the bottom of the drill, and then the cutter can no longer go any further down, and so it's a set length. But you know what, these are really inexpensive and work really well. I will link them down below. Next up is your resizing die. So this one's a small base from RCBS, and I've had really good luck with this guy in any type of AR platform I've shot it in. The small base is just kind of like the added security of throw it in any rifle and it should work just fine. Now down here we do have our optional stuff. I'm going to go ahead and use these. This is a primer Deburr tool. So on the inside, when they create the brass, they just take a pin and stab it through the brass, and basically it blows up a bunch of little burrs where the primer comes in at. You can clean them up if you want. It's not absolutely necessary. Whether it helps or not, hopefully it does. Worst case scenario, it does. And if not, it's just a couple seconds, doesn't take too long. Then I've just got a little neck brush. This is just to knock all the soot and dirt out of the case necks or even brass after I trim it. And then this is a case gauge. Now this case gauge has just a couple little, you can see the different colors, and there's a small cut along the top, there's a small cut along the bottom. You're supposed to be able to tell whether or not, see, my brass hasn't been resized so it doesn't fit down in here. This is basically supposed to be a little chamber, and then it also checks the overall length for you on your brass too. So this is not sitting down flush. This brass needs to be resized. No surprise there. That's a quick overview of the tools I'll be using. Let's get to it and start prepping this military brass. Now, compared to all the bolt action stuff that I reload, this brass is particularly dirty. So it's because that the gases from the AR system get in there, they get ejected out into the dirt and the dust, they get filled up with dirt. Overall, this stuff is really dirty. We'll get your press dirty, we'll get your dies dirty. So you do have an option of tumbling them and cleaning them up before you decap and resize and do all that. I typically wait till after, because then it will be removing the case lube, it'll be removing any excess brass that we trim out of it, maybe falls down inside the case. I prefer to clean it after I do all that. So I just kind of sacrifice having some dirty parts. I clean up the press later, I'll clean up the die later, but that's how I do it. So First step, I'm going to take some Hornady one-shot case lube. We're going to be sure to get these things coated up all nice because again, it is dirty and there is quite a bit of force going on when you do a small base resizing die. There is redding case wax, but that just takes a lot longer. And if you're trying to knock out multiple hundreds of these, I recommend Hornady one-shot. So I'm going to go spray these in the garage. We'll be right back. And then it will be time to set up our resizing die and get cracking on that. All right guys, got these things lubed up, got this camera sitting in front of my Mech Marksman single stage press. This press has been super awesome, really buttery smooth. I really like it. Only complaint is that when it pops primers out, a lot of times they just fall out of the little tray here, but that's really the only downside. Moving on. So we're gonna grab our brass. We need to go ahead and get the correct shell holder. The Mech Marksman has this little spring-loaded guy here. Pop shell holder out. Looks like shell holder number 4 is our winner. Yep. Got a good fit in there. There we go. Now our brass can slide in. Now we need to take our full length small base resizing die. And I don't know if I've had this set up in this press before. The lock ring on the die was loose, which tells me I probably didn't have it set up. Come down, make contact with it. We'll just snug the ring up for now, and then we'll run a piece through and we'll see what it does to our shoulder length. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take our calipers and we're going to push the brass up into the comparator. That number right there is irrelevant. Hit 0. Make sure we can consistently get that number. Looks like we're -1 thou. 0 back out. Okay, that's where we want it to be. So let's go ahead and resize this piece of brass right here. We're going to see if it pushes our shoulders back. Now, because this is a semi-automatic, we're looking for 3 to 4 thousandths of shoulder movement. So let's go ahead and pop it out. It may be a bit more than that because I'm not sure which rifle this came out of. If it was a service rifle, it's probably got a little more headspace than my rifle does. So let's take this guy. Okay, now it actually moved the shoulder forward, which means we need to adjust our die down. Basically the expander ball up inside here, it grabbed a hold of the neck as we were pulling the brass back down and it stretched our brass back out. So let's move this. It doesn't take much, but because it was 3 thousandths long, I'll move it a little more than I typically would. We can run this piece up through here again. I don't want to run it too many times through here because it just work hardens the brass. Really bottom out that press. Let's take another measurement. Okay, now we're back down to 0, which is good. So we're going to set this piece of brass aside and I'm going to start with another piece because I'm still going after the same goal here. I want -3. I'm going to move that guy just a little bit more. See where this lands us. This will also give us a better idea of what it's going to do on the first run through the die. And we can check them as we go through the rest of the brass. If you're doing bulk amounts, absolutely I would suggest doing multiple checks along your way. Probably once every 5 pieces or so, just because it's easy to do. Bam, right on the money. -4 thousandths, it was -3.5 a second ago, right there. That is where we want our brass, and that was the first time we ran it through there. So, let's just take one more piece of brass. Yeah, this shoulder is actually smaller than our original piece. So, take this, run it up into our die. We'll see where this puts the final shoulder depth. Like I'm talking about, nice firm press down on the bottom. It also is popping out of it's popping our primers out, which is called decapping. You can do that on your own step, but because this is a combination of resizing and decapping, it keeps things moving along a little bit faster. Okay. I had this thing saying -3 a minute ago. -2.5, -2.5. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this piece of brass and I'm going to chamber it in my rifle and see if it likes this. All right, I went ahead and did that check in my rifle off camera. 2 things I'm looking for there. I want to make sure that with a reasonable amount of force of letting the bolt drop, that it does chamber the round completely, that the bolt completely closes in there. And then number 2 thing I'm looking for is how easy it is to grab my charging handle and pull my bolt back, how easily it extracts the brass. You want it to very easily chamber, you want it to very easily come back out. If your charging handle is extremely tight and doesn't want to let go and like you have to beat it and like really try and force this thing out of there, your brass is too large at that point, and that's bad. If your bolt doesn't go completely home and rotate and lock in, your headspace is wrong and you need to size it down smaller. So those are the two things you're looking for in your AR. Obviously, the real test will come when it comes time to fire these, but I've fired them in this rifle with this die before and I've had no issues. So I'm quite confident we should have a good time out on the range with these. Okay, now that we've done 3, every time I resize a piece of brass, I actually flip them upside down in my little brass holder here, my reloading tray, so that I know that I've resized them. So now we'll take this guy, go all the way to the bottom of the press, really smash it down at the bottom, take it out, pop the primer out. We can check our headspace on every single piece if we want, and then we can just motor on along here, guys. One very important step on your resizing die, make sure you're getting a good firm press at the bottom for consistency. If you're not pushing real hard on one and then you really crank it down on the next one, you may see a difference of 1/1000th or 2 on your headspace. So keep that in mind. That's why I always try and really crank down on every single press. But also my bench and my press mount are extremely sturdy. So like I could break the handle off my press before my bench ever moves. So, which would probably take a lot with this mech because this thing's pretty dang stout. Okay guys, we'll catch you in the next step here in a second. So let's just go ahead and get the military crimps removed out of the primer pockets since that's the way our brass is orientated. So let's go ahead and grab our drill because keeping this motorized really simplifies things and really speeds up your process. So this guy has threads. It's basically supposed to thread into a handle like this, one of these little lineman tools. But you know what? I've always just clamped this thing in my drill just to speed it up. And I really don't care about the threads anyway because I just run it in my drill. So, super simple process. Also, we're gonna start shedding some brass, so you may wanna have a little dedicated area where the brass is going to fall and stay out of your way. So, all it does, you can see that there's a gap between the brass and the backside of this cutter here. It can kind of wobble around. By the time you remove this military crimp, it should sit flush against that cutter. So let's just, that's about all it takes. And now there's a shiny little brass ring in there, and now your primers will easily sit down in it. Tap it on the counter just to make sure that the brass falls out, and then on to the next one. And with the drill, you can really start making good time. You can knock out 50 of these pretty dang quick. Obviously, I'm just working with 15 pieces of brass because that's all I really wanted to do for this video. Now, I do recommend just doing batches of 50, and anytime you guys get a spare hour or so, just come in your room, do some brass prep real quick. I did that for a few weeks and was able to stash up probably close to 1,000 pieces of brass, and I just leave them unprimed and fully prepped. So at that point, they're ready to load. So I have a bucket of brass that I can load up with whatever I want. And I don't have a bucket of dedicated loaded stuff that maybe I didn't like the load on it or something. Obviously, you're gonna want some loaded ammo on hand, but having just fully prepped brass is really nice, especially if you wanna do some load development on something or just come up with a hunting load or whatever that you want. It's nice to have something ready to go. On to the next step. All right, now this is one of my optional tools. This is a primer flash hole deburring tool. So this is gonna go down inside the neck of the brass and it's going to clean up the flash hole from the front side. So all you're gonna do is just, I chuck this thing up in my drill. You can leave it in the handle tool. It just takes a little bit longer on each piece. Basically, you cut it until you don't feel any more cutting going on and it pops right out. It doesn't take much. You can zip through these pretty quick. The reason I do this is just because if I take care of it the first time that I prep this brass, I don't ever have to do this again. So that's what's nice about it. Same with the military crimp removal. Once you do it once, you never have to do it again. So just knock it out the first time you prep the brass and you don't have to worry about it anymore. And then I know that any military brass that I've reloaded has had it done, and I don't have to think about it. Like, I just know, okay, I took my time the first time and took care of it. This is an optional step. You can get the tool. They're pretty cheap. I think they're like 10 to 15 bucks. Or at least they used to be. Maybe they're 20 or whatever, but I mean, it's kind of more for precision reloading. But on brass that like was made in bulk like this, definitely not a bad idea to just try and get rid of any burrs you can, because it's made so quickly. And there's a lot of burrs in these things. I can see a ton of brass getting dumped out the bottom here. All right, so at this point we can now use our case gauge because we've resized our brass. So we can drop this guy down in here. We can take a look at how flush it sits up top. You can run your finger across it to feel where it lines up. This one's just a tiny bit proud on the low line, but it definitely sits below the top line. So there's really fine differences between there. It's only a couple thousandths difference. And then up front, you can see how far the neck of the brass is sticking out of the a little hole up there, and it's definitely proud on both surfaces, which means this needs to be trimmed, which is not really a surprise, because once you resize it and squish it all back down together, and then you drag that expander ball through there, your brass does stretch. And over time, if you resize it enough, you'll get a weak point down near the base of the case, and you can get a case head separation, and that's basically the failure point on most brass when you reload it. You should be able to reload this thing probably 7 times plus without any real issues, but occasionally you will see some case head separations later in the brass's life, so just keep an eye out for that. So at this point, guys, we are ready to trim our brass up. Now this is definitely going to make a pile of brass, and getting back to my previous point, you don't have to. You can measure it and see where it ends up needing to be. You may be able to squeeze by without absolutely having to trim your brass at the start. I recommend doing it at the beginning, just so you know anytime in the future, hey, this was trimmed at least once. Let's just give it a quick check, but it should all be uniform. That's the biggest difference, is that once I trim all this, I know that it's all going to start out the same length in life, and we can move on from there. Okay, this thing's really simple. This little shell holder is threaded. As you tighten or loosen it, it's going to pull it against the base steel part that clamps in your jaw, in your drill chuck there. So slide it into the brass holder, tighten it up. Now it's being held in place. Sometimes it takes a little bit of force to do this. Your fingers will probably get tired after doing 100 pieces of this. But then you take this guy, and like I mentioned, it's got a cutting edge right along where my thumb is, and then this sets the overall length. The little pin goes through the flash hole and comes in contact with the steel base in the bottom. So it is a set length from where the pin comes in contact with the steel and where the cutter head is. And you will definitely feel this thing cutting, and you'll see brass coming off, and then all of a sudden it'll get really light to where it doesn't feel like there's any resistance. That means it's done cutting. So let's run through here. Absolutely cutting a bunch of brass off there. You can see it. There we go. Did you hear the drill too? It got a little bit more free range in it. It's not doing anything. So we can pop this guy off. Now, while I have this chucked in the drill, this is the easiest point to just chamfer and deburr, and it's taken that brass and basically cut it all down flat, so there's definitely burrs going on the inside. So let's just give it a quick little zip. That's done. That's done. So then, there you go, guys. That's as simple as it is. I mean, you don't even have to run the drill. You can just use it with your hand because it doesn't take much. We're not trying to sharpen this brass by any means. Pop that piece out. It's trimmed to length, it's chamfered and deburred, and this guy is ready to be cleaned at this point because it's ready to go. I'll give you guys another example. Slip it into that little shell holder, twist it around. Now, sometimes when you cut this, if you didn't tighten that up enough, the brass will come loose. But it's really simple. You just stop, retighten it, and you're good to go. Another good thing about this type of cutter is that it makes the case mouth square. Some trimmers out there may or may not do that. See, it doesn't take much here. And there we go, guys. So obviously, from trimming brass off of the case neck, trimming brass out on the inside, as well as that primer, as well as the primer pocket trimming we did, there's a lot of brass that gets cut away from the brass. So I like to tumble and clean my brass after I've done all this, just to make sure that I'm not firing little shards of brass down my barrel. It's probably just not great for it. So keep that in mind as you're going. It's it's definitely good to clean your brass after all this. And some pieces of brass are not as long as others, which is again why I talked about you just want to make sure everything starts out at the same point. So some may require more trimming than others. This guy was pretty close to being in spec, and probably wouldn't have been an issue without trimming it. So look guys, we can take our calipers. Let's get them zeroed out at the top. Verify that they're zeroed out. Now we can measure the overall length of our brass. 1.753 is what that measures. Now we can just take a reloading manual. And you can take the little cheap guys like this. This is really awesome for 223 or 556 because you get so many different brands of the data here. So let's just zip back. This is Sierra bullets. Let's see what Sierra recommends for a trim length on 223. So trim 2 length 1.750. We're just 3 thousandths over that. Typically you get a 10 thousandths variation of brass length. You want to start at the 1.750, but we're 1.753. So it's within that 10 thousandths window. We're completely fine with that. And I'm ready to go hit the range. With this brass, it will not cause any issues in my chamber. So again, we can check it on our case gauge, drop it down in there. I know that our headspace is good because it's not sitting proud on that surface. And then on the front now, it sits just above the trim length, which is the lower portion down here, but it's sitting below the top surface there. So it's within spec. I'm ready to load this guy up and hit the range. So guys, I'm definitely curious to know if you are new to reloading and you have not started reloading yet. Are you just watching videos to do some homework? Or at this point, have you been reloading for a little bit? Just wanted to make sure that your process was comparable to someone else's. If so, if you guys have any tips for different ways I could do things, please drop them down below. That will help anybody watching this video. Definitely let me know your process on this stuff and maybe when you prefer to clean your brass. You could clean it twice. That's definitely not a problem. It's just a little more time consuming. So I choose to do it here at the end because I like clean brass right at the end so that it's cleanest, ready to load. Now that brings up another point, is that we have 3 ways that we can clean brass. You can do dry media tumbling, and that's like a long time budget option. Definitely a great way to go. That's what I started with. Or you have wet tumbling, where you add some type of media to bounce around in the soapy water with the brass. That is really effective and makes brass look really, really good, even though it can start out really aged and tarnished like this. And then finally, I have an ultrasonic cleaner. Hornady also sells an ultrasonic cleaner. It's a great way to go. It gets down inside the brass and cleans it up really well. Cleans out the primer pockets really well. It's really cool, but obviously may not be what everyone has. So I'm just gonna throw these guys in a dry media tumbler at the end to kind of show you that process, and that will pretty much round out this video. So this is our dry media little tumbler here. This is a Frankfurt Arsenal quick and easy case tumbler. So I just take my reloading tray here, dump all my brass in, and you just fire it up. Pretty simple. Well, all right guys, just pulled these out of the media tumbler, got them separated from the media. Basically, I just pick them out of the little corncob media there, tap them on the side, and they drain right out. So anything with a larger case mouth is always easier, but little 223s, you kind of got to struggle with it. There are case media separators that you can buy. I just haven't done it because I don't use it enough to where I really care that much. Anyway, I like to keep this stuff on hand, just fully prep brass, like I mentioned, so you can just throw a primer in it, throw the powder you want, and the bullet on top. Obviously, if you have the components you need, go ahead and load it all up, but you know what? In times like these where components are hard to find, might as well knock out some brass prep, so when the time comes that you do find something that you need and you can finally load up some ammo, you've got all your brass ready to roll. It's always good to be able to prep it and whatnot, and this stuff's absolutely worth something if it's ready to go like this. That's worth a ton of money to somebody. Fully prepped brass is awesome, so definitely keep it around. I hope you guys enjoyed the tutorial here, saw my process, what I go through. I shared with you the tools that I use, what I think is absolutely necessary, what I think is optional. I do go over the top a little bit in some areas, like the primer flash hole deburring. You definitely don't have to do that, but I just do, so I know that it's taken care of the first time I go through the brass. And like I mentioned, you don't ever have to do that again. Once it's cut away, it's done, you're ready to roll. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I greatly appreciate your time. My name is Logan from West Desert Shooter. Check out the affiliate links down below. I'm going full-time on YouTube, and that's how you can help support me. I really appreciate your guys' time. We will see you in the next one.